Hello once again from the Prim. Well, here we are tackling the final guideline from the APA Guidelines for Men and Boys, Guideline 10. Fortunately, the 10th guideline is mercifully short, only a bit longer than a single page, so hopefully there won't be too much muck to wade through. With that, let's get going. Guideline 10. Psychologists understand and strive to change institutional, cultural, and systemic problems that affect boys and men through advocacy, prevention, and education. Hey, you mean kinda like taking the time to challenge these awful biased guidelines you lot have put out? I don't know if I should feel good that I'm technically already ahead of the curve or feel bad because I'm technically following one of the APA guidelines for men and boys. Well, let's go ahead and look at how they would define this one so we can see for ourselves. Rationale. Some men encounter institutional, cultural, or systemic barriers to their well being, as evidenced by societal problems wherein men are disproportionately overrepresented. For instance, one of the major areas affecting boys and men is the high incarceration rate in the United States. Data obtained from the Federal Bureau of Prisons reveals the extent of the problem. For example, men account for 93% of all adults in federal prison to date, and although African American and Latino males constitute approximately 7% and 8% of the general population, respectively, they make up 37% and 34% of the federal prison population. Native American men are imprisoned at more than 4 times the rate of white men. These racial, ethnic, and gender disparities may be the result of racial, ethnic, and gender stereotypes. Indeed, compared to white and higher-income men, African American, Latino, and Native American men and low-income men are more likely to be detained by law enforcement. Okay, so this first paragraph was a bit of an inverse kombucha girl meme for me. I was impressed that, yes, they were bringing up an issue that legitimately impacts men much, much more than women, even for comparable crimes. As those of you who watch my channel will know, there tends to be a rather strong women are wonderful effect when it comes to determining the level of retribution levied against crimes committed. This means that women who commit even very heinous crimes will often face dramatically lower sentences than comparable men would in their shoes. So talking about how this issue impacts men disproportionately sounded like a good start. However, as you can see, it quickly devolves into nitpicking about different racial groups. Guys, I know we're a bit long in the tooth for this document, but this is the guidelines for men and boys, not the finicky IDPOL guidelines for different racial groups. This may sound like a bit of a lower priority gripe on my end, as research does show that there is a racial bias in sentencing as much as there is a gender bias. I am not denying that part, but as I'm pretty sure I've mentioned before in some of the earlier guidelines, this document should be about prioritizing discussing more general concerns that impact men and boys as a group, as roughly 50% of the population of the world. By dividing our attention into smaller and smaller groups like this, what exactly are we achieving? We may think we're trying to be more complete in addressing as many different identity groups as possible, but in that event, all we wind up doing is focusing less on the group we're meant to be focusing on and turning it into a who has it worst contest, whether that's our intention or not. For example, knowing that certain races face incarceration more often than others, should we be targeting our intention on those specific groups? Or, as a whole, would it be more effective for us to look at the entire justice system and try to advocate for changes that would positively impact all men and boys? You know, things like advocating for restorative rather than retributive responses to crime, addressing overall gender bias in sentencing practices, offering prisoners education and job skills training that would allow them to make better choices once they have served their debt to society, etc., etc. When we start getting into the weeds about who has it worst, this can get in the way of problem solving rather than help to facilitate it, especially when we start losing sight of the forest for the trees and what we're all supposed to be here to learn about. To be clear, once again, I'm not saying these aren't issues worth dealing with, but put another way, If I'm looking up a recipe trying to make spaghetti, I don't really need to have a bunch of random asides in there talking about other Italian recipes. Let's just focus on what we all came here for, capiche?
One final comment before I move on. Again, I'm pretty sure it's one I've made before, so sorry about that, but it bears repeating. Men and boys, as a group, should not at all times need to have an asterisk appended to them with a copious stream of additional identifiers listed beneath in order for us to be able to justify caring about them. Think of the difference we would see in the world by simply telling men, "We care about you because you are worth caring about. No additional descriptors or conditions needed." Shouldn't be a revolutionary idea. Let's move on.
Men of color also have less access to addiction treatment, a significant cause of racial disparity in the criminal justice system, as more than 60% of federal inmates are incarcerated because of drug offenses. Thus, African American men are many times more likely to go to prison for drug offenses, e.g., possession of marijuana or crack cocaine, than white men, even though they are less likely to use illegal drugs. Okay, or let's just keep drilling hard into those different identity pieces, shall we? Anyway, just on its face, I thought this sounded like a bit of an unusual claim, so just for the fun of it, I decided to look up some statistics myself. I consulted multiple documents from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for several years or sets of years. The most recent one I found was for 2023, so perhaps let's just go ahead and consult that one. Specifically looking at the illicit drug use section, we see the following information. The percentage of people aged 12 or older in 2023 who used illicit drugs in the past year was higher among American Indian or Alaska Native, 36.7%, or multiracial people, 36.2%, than among white, 26.1%, Hispanic, 21.6%, or Asian people, 12.4%. The percentage also was higher among multiracial people than among black people, 27.7%. Black or white people were more likely to have used illicit drugs in the past year compared with Hispanic people. So, statistics was never my strongest class, but this hardly seems like there was a massive delta here between white and black individuals. And in this year, the percentage for black individuals is actually a higher number than white individuals. To be fair to the APA guidelines, for the years that correspond to when they likely did their research, the numbers do show a slightly lower use for black individuals, but again, it's not by a significantly wide margin. If anything, it's worth noting that Native Americans struggle far more with this problem for what should probably be obvious reasons, given the societal challenges this population faces. However, commentary on this is surprisingly absent here.
Again, this is all entirely beside the point that we should really be talking about men and boys in general, rather than wasting time arguing about which group of men has it worse. But hey, at least let's be honest about the numbers. Now, the rest of this paragraph talks about undocumented boys and men being overrepresented in federal detention facilities and all the risk factors involved in immigration. And I personally don't have any issues with this section, so in the interest of time, I'll just move on to the next paragraph.
Another area disproportionately associated with boys and men is violence. Epidemiological research indicates that men of all races are at an increased risk for being either a victim or perpetrator of violence, especially during adolescence. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that violence is the second leading cause of death among people between the ages of 15 and 24, and reports from state and national surveys of youth behaviors suggest that young men are more likely than young women to engage in serious aggressive behaviors. For instance, findings from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey indicated that teenage boys were significantly more likely than teenage girls to report carrying a gun to school. Investigators have also noted that nearly every school shooter in the past 30 years has been an adolescent male.
I don't think anyone will deny that men and boys, on average, tend to be more violent than women and girls. But why select an example like this to illustrate that point? It's just such atypical and violent imagery. I guarantee you that the vast majority of therapists will not deal with cases this extreme when working with male children and youth. Why not choose more common examples, such as roughhousing or physical altercations? It just strikes me as disingenuous and needlessly alarmist. It's like the previous example. It's not like it's a bad thing to acknowledge that these things do happen. It's just odd when you're presenting this as your choice illustration when talking about aggressive behavior.
For adults, the National Center for Victims of Crime estimates that 90% of all homicides in the United States are committed by men, and men constitute 77% of all homicide victims. State and local data also indicate that men are far more likely than women to be arrested and charged with intimate partner violence.
Hey, I'm just a bit curious, but are we going to get to the point where the research also shows just how much men are reluctant to report intimate partner violence at the hands of their wives? Or how, when they do report that, they are often at best dismissed and at worst made fun of or even arrested? Hey, remember the first point that you made in this guideline, how men are overrepresented in federal prisons? I wonder how often, when it is actually being reported that women are violent to their male partners, that they are actually being arrested or especially being incarcerated. I don't mean to sound quite so salty on this point, but this is my main area of study, folks. And if the last point was disingenuous, this point is worse. I swear to God, lies, damned lies, and statistics. Hard to interpret data that doesn't get reported in the first place, don't you think?
Although most violence is perpetrated by men, most men are not violent. Consequently, men are often stereotyped as aggressive and violent. Gosh, thanks for throwing 'em that bone, fellas. Very generous of you to say. Again, it sounds a wee bit funny after your aforementioned examples of school shootings and homicides, but hey, gold star effort though. These stereotypes can have negative consequences for heterosexual men who experience violence in intimate relationships from their female partners. Although abusive women, on average, may do less physical damage than abusive men, physical assaults from female partners have been shown to create myriad psychological problems for men. In addition, male victims of intimate partner violence experience significant barriers to finding help because the domestic violence system has historically focused on helping battered women. Likewise, men who have experienced sexual abuse from women or men may face significant personal and professional barriers to seeking help.
All right, all right. I'll give credit where credit is due. There are some solid points brought up here that I myself have argued many times deserve to be addressed. Good on you, APA guidelines, although I'm not quite sure why you needed to sneak in that little comment that abusive women do less physical damage than abusive men. Couldn't resist trying to minimize the issue, eh?
Housing is also a significant area of gender discrimination. Oh, good. It's a good idea to address how men make up a large majority of the homeless population. Reports demonstrate that 20% of transgender people have experienced housing discrimination, another 20% have experienced homelessness, and 10% have been evicted specifically for their gender identity at some point throughout the lifespan. Wait, what? Why are we focusing on transgender individuals again all of a sudden? Why? What is even going on here? And you know what? They never get back to talking about homelessness as it relates to men at all. They throw a brief reference to housing access improving health outcomes and proceed to drop the issue. What's worse, that's where the rationale part of the guideline ends. Who in the hell greenlit this? This is like someone writing a book called The Complete History of World War II that talks exclusively about Hitler's rise to power, has a few paragraphs about the Night of the Long Knives, and makes an odd reference here and there to concentration camps and then calls it a day.
There are so many well documented and uncontested issues that primarily impact men and boys that didn't even merit a sidelong glance in this guideline. Increased risk of suicide, gaps in education, men being more likely to work dangerous and high stress jobs, as well as to die on the job, than women, increasing lack of positive male role models, especially as masculinity is regularly and consistently demonized in society, men being the only ones consistently expected to fight and die in wars, Challenges with bias in the legal system regarding divorce and custody matters. The list just goes on and on. I mean, you would think in a guideline that purports to talk about the systemic issues that men experience, you would want to be a little more thorough, but I suppose not. This lackadaisical approach continues into the application section, where we have an entire 2 paragraphs with suggestions about how therapists should respond. Let's take a look.
Application. Psychologists strive to disseminate research findings to legislators and policymakers to inform public health policies and funding for research, prevention, and intervention efforts that can enhance the lives of boys, men, and their families. For example, psychologists strive to support public policy initiatives to ease problems associated with incarceration, such as humane treatment for prisoners, access to drug treatment and other rehabilitation, job training, accessible housing, and alternatives to incarceration. Likewise, psychologists aim to recognize that male violence affects everyone, men and women, and concurrently that men can also be victims of abusive relationships with women.
Okay, let's take this in order. The disseminate research findings bit is fine, but the second sentence is getting a little bit into the weeds. Do we really think it's realistic for psychologists, even those working specifically with men, to place such focus on policy initiatives in the incarceration system? It just seems a little bit oddly specific. Don't get me wrong, I certainly agree with reform in this area. After all, I mentioned many of these points earlier in this video before I'd even read this section. But, as someone who has worked with men for a little while now, I wouldn't even put prison or discussion thereof even in the top 20 issues I have talked about with my clients. So it just seems a little weird to direct my efforts to that when I could be focusing my attention on more common concerns for men as a general population. This may be just me being pedantic against a general example, but again, it just seems like an oddly specific general example, one that runs the risk of contributing to those good old stereotypes and assumptions they mentioned before about men being violent. Also, they're not helping to combat that stereotype when they drop a line like psychologists aim to recognize that male violence affects everyone, even when they toss in a little pity addendum like men can also be victims of abusive relationships. Just saying.
Psychologists also strive to increase awareness of the influence of gender role socialization practices associated with violence and problem behaviors for boys and men among public health officials, other mental health professionals, and policymakers. Work with public health officials to disseminate information regarding the destructive aspects of rigid notions of masculinity may result in inclusion of gender-sensitive public health initiatives for boys and men.
Good grief, they just can't help themselves, can they? Just look at this continued focus on violence and problem behaviors. Christ almighty, this is offensive. What about looking into the kinds of messaging that boys are receiving about their early life, about how the future is female and that masculinity is toxic, and that men are the oppressors who need to apologize for all the wrongs they have committed in society, and seeing how these messages contribute to a lack of self-esteem and personal identity? What about supporting young men who are often struggling to feel like they have a place in the world? What about helping young men to develop positive identities and personal values rather than always focusing on their capacity for violence and problem behaviors?
Wasn't it the very last guideline in which you were talking about the problem of the tendency for many psychologists to focus on a deficits perspective rather than a strengths perspective? I swear to God, there's more holes in this document than in a slice of Swiss cheese. Did anyone think to look through this thing to check for inconsistencies in attitudes, or was it just a room full of monkeys on typewriters that put this together? Psychologists also are encouraged to advocate for more financial support for research studies aimed at boys and men, with special attention to neglected areas of research, such as examining masculinity with other social identity-based experiences, e.g. racism, ability, socioeconomic status, in relation to social problems impacting boys and men. Indeed, despite the disproportionate number of men of color in the prison system for violent crimes, Most popular theories of violence and aggression do not take into account men's gender role, socialization, and racial experiences. Such research may attend to the complexities of gender minority people's multicultural identities and provide insight into mental health outcomes for those facing multiple layers of oppression.
I've already talked about the problems with the focus on different identity pieces by psychologists, but that last sentence offers me what I think is a strong platform on which to end this whole dog and pony show. Let me offer you a little tip, free of charge. Most men, they're not interested in narratives of oppression and victimhood. In fact, even those who have been victimized will go to great lengths to minimize their experiences. That's just not the kind of language that appeals to men as a broader subset of humans. Men who are often taught, directly or indirectly, that their worth lies in what they are able to do for those around them, who often grow up with media that showcases heroes making great personal sacrifices to save those around them, who are often told that they need to be strong and to get things done. They don't have a lot of use for the Oppression Olympics. A guideline that talks about how therapists should focus on men from this kind of lens, from either a research or practice perspective, is shooting so wide of the mark that it's actually astounding. I tell you what, instead of, well, practically anything in this application section, I essentially suggest a two-pronged approach psychologists should take with regard to men. 1. Psychologists should strive, both in research and public policy, to advocate against the use of male negative and shaming language. After all, men who are shamed and othered in society are those least likely to be able to have a positive sense of self, to form positive relationships, to lead productive, self assured lives, and are far more at risk of isolation, mental health challenges, and suicide. 2. Both in research and in private practice, psychologists should approach men's issues from a place of respect, dignity, and strengths building. In public policy, psychologists should advocate that as many places as possible should address men with a sense of appreciation for the roles they take in society, as builders, as workers, as providers, as fathers, and should strive to work towards building these positive identities in boys through development of personal values and relevant skills. Psychologists should strive to educate others on the dangers of taking a negative shame based approach and should provide concrete examples of alternative approaches to supporting boys and men. I promise you, if everyone in the field decided to take this approach, we would see rapid improvements in men's mental health across the board, guaranteed.
Wow, it's hard to believe that after all this time, this project has finally come to an end. It's over. It's done. It hasn't exactly been an easy journey, but I think it's important to talk about the approaches being put out by large organizations that are governing entire fields like this. I know these guidelines are only aspirational, which I don't think I can put enough finger quotes around the use of that word in this context. But nevertheless, when a group as large and influential as the American Psychological Association makes guidelines like these, psychologists of all stripes will be looking to them for guidance and will take their words to heart. Unfortunately, when these guidelines often have more harmful than helpful messages, it's important that good psychologists take a stand and challenge them, not only so that we can do better in the future, but also so that we can avoid harming our vulnerable clients. Interestingly, these guidelines have an expiry date, which is in 2028. I'm pretty sure this document smelled like sour milk right out of the gate, but hey, maybe when they decide it's time to put out a new batch, we'll see some positive changes. Not gonna hold my breath, but hey, a psychologist can hope, right? And now that we've tackled this Gorgon, pretty soon it'll be time to jump into the APA's corresponding guidelines for women and girls. Don't worry, I'm sure it'll be just as full of useful information as this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.